Right, so as a result of the central and peripheral adaptations, what we find with aerobic training is that our bodies are more apt to produce energy or ATP through the oxidative energy system because there's readily available oxygen in the muscle, and there's the mitochondria available uh, as sites to produce ATP. And because we have this greater reliance on oxidative energy production, and it can fuel the muscular contractions, we will raise what's called our lactate threshold, where we start to accumulate lactate. And the reason we can raise that to a greater percentage of our VO2 max, so we're raising it to a higher intensity before we start to accumulate lactate, is because we have this great capacity to meet the exercising muscles' needs oxidatively. And because of these adaptations, again, centrally and peripherally, our ability to consume and use oxygen is much greater through greater blood supply to the muscle, greater capillary blood flow, increase organelles, the mitochondria, sites where we produce ATP, greater enzymes for oxidative energy production. So this is how we enhance this oxidative capacity. And then there's also more of a reliance on using free fatty acids over glycogen for energy production. And so it allows us to have a somewhat unfatigable source of substrates for energy production. And so we conserve our glycogen. And so the chronic adaptations that occur within the endocrine system, we don't have we have a decreased hormone response at a given submaximal workload, and then our catecholamine, epinephrine, and our growth hormone, our insulin levels, all of those decrease in response to exercise. And we have, as I mentioned before, this increased insulin sensitivity. So our insulin is used more effectively, and so we have a decreased need for insulin release because we use what we have better. More effective control of our blood glucose. And these types of benefits from the endocrine system usually we lose within 72 hours. We talked about with resistance training the benefit of increasing the strength of our bones, our bone mineral density. And for aerobic exercise, it has to be at higher intensity. So it's not just walking, it would be running, plyometrics where you're doing explosive force, circuit training, things like basketball where you're jumping and running. Those are the type of aerobic activities that will increase the strength of your bones. And just as in connective tissue, or the resistance training, we said our tendons and ligaments got stronger. The same thing will occur with aerobic exercise. And also we find the articular cartilage, which lays on the surface of the bones where the two bones come together to form a joint, it actually gets thicker, so it provides some protection with activities like running. But there's still we need for more research. Unfortunately, much of the research is based on animal studies. As far as body composition, what happens with our body fat, with that, considering that more than 60% of adults in the U.S. are either overweight or obese, aerobic exercise is really important to decrease body fat. And so what they find is that when people meet the minimal standard of 150 minutes a week of moderate intensity aerobic exercise, it has some benefit for weight loss, but it's not a substantial benefit. 150 minutes is not really a lot of time to burn many calories. But when people exercise greater than 150 minutes per week, they exhibit increased weight loss. So they call this a dose response relationship. So in essence, the more we exercise, the more time we exercise, the greater the benefit's going to be, because we just expend calories. And with that, we will decrease the amount of fat on our body while maintaining muscle mass. And this is one of the important things. If people try to diet by calorie restriction alone, they lose fat, but they also lose muscle. And so their metabolism will slow down as they lose muscle. Whereas when people combine caloric restriction with exercise, they'll lose fat, but they also maintain their muscle mass. So they maintain their metabolism rather than just things slowing down, the metabolism slowing down, and the body. When people just cut their calories, their body tries to conserve their body weight. So when we've talked about lactate threshold, and we said it had to be intense to get that, bump up that lactate threshold, and this is pretty much what we're seeing here with steady state training. That's just running the same pace, just doing a 10-minute mile or 8-minute mile steady state. That will not increase muscle strength. It won't increase power or sprint training. So for us to bump up our lactate threshold, improve the ability that our pace, we have to do more intense effort, like interval training. And the positive side to many of the benefits we looked at is the health benefits to aerobic exercise. So we have a decreased risk of cardiovascular diseases like stroke and heart attack, decreased risk of breast cancer, colon cancer. It can potentially decrease resting and exercise blood pressure, decrease the risk of diabetes because of the more insulin sensitivity, potentially decrease the risk of osteoporosis depending on what type of aerobic training we do. So these are major diseases. Heart disease is the #1 killer in the U.S. for men and women, and so if we can significantly, through exercise, to decrease the risk of heart disease, aerobic exercise really is a major benefit to enhancing health in the U.S. And then just like with muscle, with endurance, with resistance training, we apply the specificity principle with aerobic exercise. So the muscle groups that we train are the muscles that get the benefit. So if I'm going to be doing a running race, I'm not going to train by swimming because there are different muscle groups, different muscle action, potentially different energy systems. So I want to train as similar to the event that I'm going to be doing. So if I'm a sprinter, I'm not going to be doing endurance training because they're different energy systems. And then specificity of training is to identify these benefits. I have to test in the same mode. So if someone is a biker, that's how they've been training, is by riding a bike. I'm not going to put them on the treadmill to see the differences. That would not be as sensitive an indicator. So we are very specific when we train to the muscle groups that we use, the energy systems that we use. They're similar to the event that we're training for, and then specificity of testing as well. Difference with genetics, we just have different capacities. We have different amounts of slow twitch, fast twitch muscles, and muscle fibers, and so genetically we just have different potentials. And so you can start two people training at the same time with the same intensities, but one person might progress faster and have a much greater potential, and so that just is reflective of individual differences, and that's something we have to be sensitive to. Women have smaller muscle mass, and so they're going to have a lower cardiac output because they won't have as strong as great a stroke volume. They won't have as strong a heart to pump out the blood, and they're going to have a lower blood volume. So that's going to decrease the ability to send oxygenated blood to the working muscles. They noticed boys and girls reach their VO2 max at different ages. And then we also see as people age, they can decrease their aerobic capacity, but if they maintain some type of training, they can minimize much of the decline. And that much of the deterioration can be reversed with training. I know somebody who's been a lifetime runner, close to 70 years old, and he can still beat many younger people. And it's just that he's maintained throughout his life running, and he has a tremendous exercise potential. But some of that's genetics as well. I have to watch out for overtraining. Just as with resistance training, if someone overtrains, they apply the overload principle, make too big a jumps, or they're exercising too intensely, too frequently, then we can see decrease in performance. So they'll have a lot of fatigue, their times will deteriorate. You'll see things like their resting heart rate may not recover as quickly, and they might have a higher heart rate response to a given submaximal workload. So that's just something to, just like with resistance training is, yes, we have to apply the overload principle for improvement, but if we're too aggressive and we don't allow time for rest, that people's performance can deteriorate. And there's also the detraining that occurs, and that is with when we stop exercising aerobically, we can within even 2 weeks we won't lose all our benefit, but we start to decrease some of those changes that we see within the muscle and the improved oxidative quality. So we have to, if we have a period of time where we can't do our usual workout, even if we do it less intensely, not as long a duration or less frequently, that's going to slow down the deconditioning effect. And this is a slide that probably shouldn't be on here. It was it's kind of an interesting article, though, if you want to pull it up. It was in the American Society of Exercise Physiologists, and they published an article that our research, and they feel that you can resistance training to failure can achieve many of the benefits as you would in an aerobic exercise program. And so this is just kind of reflective of what's out there in the community, people interested in exercise science, is that there are different opinions. And you just have to study research after research and see what eventually filters out. If remember, one study doesn't prove anything. And so this might be something interesting you can do a search on and find.